As a result of the Pannonian War, the Romans pacified the interior of Dalmatia and conquered the southern part of Pannonia between the Sava and the Drava. These conquests, combined with the formation of the province of Moesia, allowed the Romans to establish a frontier line along the Danube River along the middle reaches of the river. However, the conquered tribes were not going to give up so easily. The intensity of hostilities was sharply reduced, but the establishment of complete peace was still far away. Over the next decade and a half, Roman legions crossed the Danube several times during the still ongoing military operations against the Dacians and other barbarian tribes. The chronology of these campaigns, undertaken simultaneously from two directions, from Pannonia and from Moesia, is not entirely clear, as they are poorly recorded in the sources. Sextus Apuleius, who succeeded Tiberius as commander-in-chief, completed the conquest of the Pannonians. At the same time or a little earlier, Marcus Vinicius, governor of Macedonia, defeated the armies of the Dacians and their allies Bastarnae beyond the Danube and brought other tribes to submission. To the same period belongs the successful campaign of Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus, who drove back the Dacians and Sarmatians beyond the Danube and established guard posts on the right bank of the river. These military actions ran parallel to the renewed Roman offensive in Germany. Lucius Domitius Agenobarbus, advancing through barely pacified territory, reached the shore of the Elbe with his legions. His brutal and incompetent rule led to unrest in the province. As soon as Domitius returned to Rome, the local tribes revolted. His successor, the already familiar Marcus Vinicius, won some successes in fighting them, for which he was decreed triumphal decorations. He was, however, never able to bring about a decisive break in the opposition. In the year 4, the command in Germany passed into the hands of Tiberius, who had returned from exile. The troops he commanded enthusiastically welcomed the return of their leader. Military operations between the Rhine and the Weser were carried out on a grand scale. Pursuing the retreating enemy, the Roman legions reached the Elbe. After the campaigns were pacified tribes between the Rhine and Weser, the subject of Tiberius' concern was the kingdom of the Marcomanni in present-day Bohemia. The Maribod who ruled it had considerable resources, including an army of 70,000 infantry and 4,000 horsemen. These forces undoubtedly posed a threat to Roman attempts to consolidate the conquered territories. Significant forces were brought in for the planned offensive against Mariboda. Tiberius himself was to march at the head of 5 legions. He was to be met from Mogontiacum by Sentius Saturninus with 4 Germanic legions. Both armies were only 5 transitions from the appointed meeting place, as suddenly in the headquarters of the commander-in-chief came the news of the revolt that broke out in Pannonia. The roots of unrest in the province lay in the forced Romanization of the conquered territories. Their inhabitants were levied taxes, the collection of which was accompanied by extortion and violence on the part of the provincial administration. Common abuses included land confiscations, forced sale of foodstuffs at low prices, troop stays, and court fees. Complaints to the governor did not bring any result and only caused mutual bitterness. The immediate cause of the uprising was the intensified military recruitment undertaken among the recently conquered tribes on the eve of the campaign against Maribod. When the new recruits joined those who had already been carrying the burden of military service for some time, it made them realize their numbers and strength. Many of the rebels had a history of service in the Roman army. They were familiar not only with discipline and weapons, but also with the language of the Romans. This circumstance, according to the historian Villae Patercula, contributed greatly to the initial success of the performance. At the head of the rebels were the leaders of the Dalmatian Decide Baton and Pinus and the chief of the Pannonian Logs, who was also called Baton. Initially the number of their supporters was small, but soon after they began to speak, they were joined by numerous Dalmatian and Pannonian tribes. The total number of unruly Villae Paterculus estimated at 200,000 infantry and 9,000 horsemen. Because of the large number of rebels, the complexity of the theater of operations and the difficulty of communications, this war, according to Suetonius, was the most difficult of all that the Romans had to fight since the Punic Wars. The unrest began when the main Roman forces under the command of Tiberius marched out of Carnunta. The favorable moment determined the initial success of the intervention. The rebels easily defeated the troops sent against them and besieged the largest cities of the province. In Rome, the news of the rebellion caused such fear that even Caesar Augustus succumbed to it. He issued a proclamation in the Senate that if action was not taken immediately, the enemy might appear before the city in as little as 10 days. A state of emergency was declared in Italy. Tiberius was ordered to make peace with Maroboduus on any terms and to return to Carnuntus. To prevent the rebels from immediately invading Italy, which at that time remained undefended, Tiberius sent his legate Marcus Valerius Messala Messalina with the 10th Legion to Siscia. As the further course of events showed, this fear proved to be largely exaggerated. The rebels missed their chance. It is not even known whether the Gepodes, a strong tribe living on the border with Italy, participated in the revolt or not. At this stage the struggle, according to the description of Velleius Paterculus, unfolded in two main directions. In Pannonia, the Brevians, led by their leader Baton, besieged Sirmium, the main Roman base on the middle Danube. The garrison of the city was few in number and hardly repulsed the attacks of the besiegers. The governor of neighboring Moesia, Aulus Caecina Severus, came to his aid. With his former legions, accompanied by auxiliary Thracian detachments sent by Roman ally King Remotok, he arrived under the walls of Sirmium, immediately forcing the logs to lift the siege. However, he was unable to build on his initial success, as news arrived at the camp that the borders of his own province were already being threatened by the Dacians and Sarmatians. Refusing to pursue the retreating enemy, the Roman commander was forced to go back. Decidiati under the command of Baton and Pinus at this time approached the capital of Dalmatia Salona, but could not take a wall-fortified city. In the battle Baton was severely wounded by a stone and was temporarily out of action. His troops set about plundering the Dalmatian coast, reaching Apollonia in the south and devastating the western limits of Macedonia. With the approach of Messala Messalina with his legion Baton, still suffering from his wound, marched to meet him. In the first skirmishes success was on the side of the rebels. With 20,000 soldiers, Baton managed to surround Messala, who had only one legion at his disposal, and that, half the composition. Nevertheless, in a decisive battle, the Roman commander managed to lure the enemy into an ambush and overpower him. This victory decided the outcome of the campaign. The Romans were able to hold Siskiyou and maintain a line of direct communication with Italy. Nevertheless, Salona and starting from it Ignacieva road leading to Macedonia, were cut off from the Pannonian army large forces of rebels. Defeated, but not broken, Baton with the remnants of his forces went to join with Pannonian namesake. They managed to establish a fortified camp on Mount Alma, north of Sirmium. This position allowed the rebels to keep control of the Sava Valley and prevent Tiberius from joining Tiberius with Caecina Severa's forces from Moesia. The interior between the middle Danube and the Adriatic coast was predominantly under rebel control. Meanwhile, Augustus began to assemble a force in Italy which he intended to send to the Balkans to aid Tiberius. Veterans were called back into service, freedmen were enlisted, and young slaves were even bought from private masters for the same purpose. This force, under the command of Tiberius' stepson, the son of his brother Drusus, arrived at Siscia, where Tiberius was wintering. On the other flank of the revolt, Augustus also managed to assemble a force of 5 legions, which included 3 Mesian legions of Caecina Severa and 2 eastern legions brought with him to the Balkans by the governor of Galatia, Marcus Plautius Silvanus. These troops were joined by the Thracian auxiliaries of Rhemetocus and his brother Rescuperides. Both commanders with their troops moved to join Tiberius at Siscia through enemy-occupied territory. Near the Volscian marshes, not far from the ancient Cybelus, the modern Croatian town of Vinkovci, the Romans were suddenly attacked by superior enemy forces. The beginning of the battle was not in their favor. The rebels managed to disperse the Thracian cavalry and overturn the auxiliary cohorts. During the assault on the camp, the main forces of the rebels were pushed back from its fortifications. Legions counterattacked and snatched victory from the hands of the enemy. However, the losses of the victors were quite significant. With the arrival of reinforcements, Tiberius commanded the largest Roman army ever assembled since the civil wars. Because of the increasing difficulty of supplying such a mass of troops, and believing that the rebels would no longer dare to fight a decisive battle, Tiberius almost immediately dispersed these troops in different directions. Caecina Severus returned to Moesia, which because of the Dacian and Sarmatian threat could not be left unattended for long. Plautius Silvanus went to Sirmium to fight against the Logs. Tiberius himself brought Dalmatia into submission, besieging the rebel fortifications one by one. The suppression of the rebellion took a particularly brutal form, with both sides burning villages and killing captured prisoners. The turning point in the war came in the year 8. Having suffered a series of defeats, weakened by hunger and disease, the tribes involved in the rebellion, one by one began to ask for Roman terms of peace. Betrayals began to occur. The leader of the Logs Baton captured and handed over to the Romans Pinus, hoping to receive forgiveness from them for this. He himself, in turn, was besieged in a fortress and captured by his Dalmatian namesake, who executed the traitor in front of the army. Thereupon many of the Timbers laid down their arms. Those who remained were pacified by Plautius Silvanus. By the end of the summer, resistance in Pannonia had almost completely ceased. Baton took the last of his supporters to Dalmatia, where there were still smoldering pockets of resistance. The Sava Valley was once again under full Roman control. Believing that the revolt was largely suppressed, Augustus recalled Tiberius to Italy and transferred supreme command to Germanicus, so that he had time to gain military laurels. The finale of the revolt unfolded in Dalmatia. Germanicus, having marched with a part of the army from Siscia, by the valley of the river Una advanced into the region of Madzae and destroyed the fortifications of the rebels. The combined Roman armies besieged the residence of Badona, located a few kilometers north of Salona. The siege dragged on for a long time. In the end, the Romans managed to take the city by storm. Badona at the last moment managed to hide, but later he still surrendered to the Romans and was interned in Ravenna. For the victory, won at the cost of hard work, Augustus and Tiberius received a triumph. Germanicus was defined triumphal jewelry. On the fifth day, however, after the festivities were over in Rome, news reached the capital of the tragedy that had broken out in Germany. In early September 9, the newly rebellious Germans managed to ambush and completely destroy 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest, along with the auxiliary troops assigned to them. In total, about 22,000 soldiers were trapped. To them should also be added an unspecified number of non-combatants and servants. The provincial governor Publius Quintilius Verus died with his staff. His severed head of the triumphant victors sent Mariboda, and the latter, in Rome. Misfortune befell Rome at the moment of the greatest tension of its forces. In Italy again, as 3 years ago, carried out a forced mobilization. The last human resources were thrown to the Rhine, where Tiberius took command. He used the troops freed after the suppression of the Pannonian revolt, and thus was able to suspend the developing crisis. Soon an army of 8 legions was again standing on the banks of the Rhine. But the continuation of the old policy of expansion was to be forgotten. Augustus' dream of conquering the world collapsed when he seemed to be closest to the fulfillment of this plan. Indirectly recognized this and Augustus himself, advising in his will to his successor to abandon new conquests and keep within the existing borders.